the French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre struggled with the relationship between being and nothingness. Now that's probably not something that you contemplate every day. But for Sartre, that was a very important struggle. It was a question about the basics of life. How do we define being, existence? How do we know that we exist and that there is a world out there? And how do I understand my relationship between myself and the world and nothingness, where I might contemplate a certain course of action, but as I actually proceed to try to accomplish that course of action, perhaps to meet Pierre in the cafe and sit down with him and have a cup of coffee, my perception or plan of what I might want to do may come to nothingness because Pierre might not appear. Poo-poo with that. And so, Sartre was challenged by the relationship between being and nothingness. And he developed a philosophy, the existentialist philosophy, which came to the idea that existence precedes essence. That is to say that we can, in effect, determine our destiny by the use of our minds and form a life for ourselves. We are not captive or determined by the world around us. And so he challenged people to think about how they wish to live and to produce a life accordingly. But the fundamental question was the question of existence. Do things exist outside of me? Do I exist? Does God exist? It was to Sartre and to other writers that the Christian philosopher and evangelist Francis Schaeffer wrote a book in response with the resounding title, He is There and He is Not Silent. And with that book, Francis Schaeffer tried to argue for the case that God has in fact spoken. He has revealed Himself in the world around us and by His Word, so that we can know of existence. We can know of God's will. We can know God in a way which is true and meaningful. We can have, in Schaeffer's immortal words, true truth. We can understand God for who He is as He's explained Himself to us in His Word. Our understanding of God will not be comprehensive because God is infinite. But it will be a true knowledge based on God's revelation of Himself to us and based on the fact that we are creatures made in His image, so that we are capable of receiving a revelation from God and understanding that revelation. He is there, and He is not silent. That is a fundamental Christian affirmation about God and existence. He is there. But modern scholars, in their pursuit of God, in fact, the history of religions has led us in a path in which many have denied that God exists or that God can be known out there. I mentioned a moment ago Immanuel Kant and his philosophy. It was his opinion that God cannot be known out there. All we have is a construct of the mind that guides us in the formation of our lives. And for him, the concept of God was a necessary thing, not necessarily that God was out there, but it was necessary for us to have ethics and morals. The general concept of God was necessary for us to behave and do that which is right. And when you examine the history of philosophy and of religions, there is a retreat from the idea that God is an objective individual outside of us who can speak to us with authority. Rather, the history of religion and philosophy is to say that we cannot know a God outside of us. Rather, we should look within and find God within. That begins from the mystic Joachim long ago. in about the 12th century, I believe, and to more recent days when you have writings by Robert Wright and Karen Armstrong describing God, and essentially they come to the same conclusion. God is not an objective being who reveals himself authoritatively in creation and in God's Word. Rather, he's someone that we investigate and we come to know through our own thinking. When you read Robert Wright's book, The Evolution of God, he describes his process of writing, his process of investigation. How do we discover God? And he begins with the assumption, and he's very honest about admitting it up front, that he's going to explain God on materialistic terms, disregarding some kind of supernatural revelation from God in creation and in His Word, but rather looking at man's philosophies and economic relationships and various religious beliefs. He can form a scientific investigation, and from that make certain conclusions about God. And his conclusion basically is that God moves from a polytheistic past to a monotheistic future, almost to the point where God becomes within us, and we are God. And God is a pantheistic God who develops in within us, coming to His own enlightenment. Karen Armstrong does something similar, rejecting the idea of absolute truth or an objective God who speaks from outside of us. She comes from a Roman Catholic background where she was a nun, and she went to church trying to discover God. She wrestled with the idea of God and pursued Him, but didn't seem to find God in any meaningful way for her. And so she abandoned that pursuit for quite some period of time. But there was this nagging idea of God within her. And then she talks about how she began to talk with various experts in religion who counseled her to say that you really shouldn't be looking for an objective God who speaks to us from outside. Rather, you should look within and allow the creative imagination to reveal a God to you. I call that a hallucination. But nonetheless, that's the history of modern inquiry. History of modern thought. He is there. He is not silent. The Christian faith begins on a different foundation. We spoke last week on the importance of finding an adequate foundation for life. Building your life on God's Word so that you can withstand the storms of life, whether they be the intellectual, moral tests that come to us in the course of life or the very physical struggle to survive. In all of these many things, if you build your life on the foundation of God's Word, we said last week, then you have a secure foundation, one which will last and will hold you up. But if you reject the foundation of God's Word and try to build your life on the shifting sands of human opinion, of pluralism, relativity, and so forth, then you will find that sand shifts underneath you, especially when you need it most, when the storms of life hit. And you will find that house, that beautiful house that you built for yourself, this life, this essence that you've built for yourself out of your existence, is but a house of cards that will come tumbling down when the first strong wind blows. And so when we come to talk about God and this revelation of Himself, we must do so on the foundation of God's revelation of Himself. Now that might sound circular. That might sound like we're starting from a standpoint which is assuming that which is yet to be proved. But when you think about it, it's the only way in which we can understand God's revelation of Himself. Think of it like this. If there is a God who does exist, and He has revealed Himself to us, shouldn't that be an authoritative source on which we discover the meaning of who God is? Why would we discount that and say, well, I'm not going to listen to that. I will simply go off on my own and explore, assuming that does not exist, explore the rest of the world and somehow come to a conclusion about God. That would be ludicrous. That would be like the scientists trying to explain water by first discounting that water exists. And then going off into the world to try to explain it. There's no water. No water. No water in the air, no water in your glass, no water. It's something else. It's energy, spirit, whatever. We begin with the foundation of God's revelation to us. And that explains to us how we can understand that God has revealed Himself to us. And let me work that out for you here in a little bit. We read from Matthew chapter 11, where Jesus speaks of God's revelation. How God has withheld the knowledge of Himself from many, the wise, the intelligent, the mighty of this world. He has withheld His revelation, His character, His being from them, so that they can run all they wish and explore as much as they want. They will never find or understand God. God has hidden Himself from them. Not that God is being cute or trying to be coy with His creatures, but rather, man is a sinner. And he has already rejected the revelation that God has already given to him in the world around him and in His works of providence. You remember David in Psalm 19 begins this psalm by speaking of the heavens, declaring the glory of God, the earth, His handiwork. And then he says, day to day pours forth speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. When David looked at the heavens around him, the earth, as he walked through the forest and saw the trees and the rivers and streams and so forth, he saw the handiwork of God. When he considered the history of time, the development of the human race, its philosophies, its science, its wars and so forth, that too revealed God. Day after day pours forth speech. God reveals Himself in the works of providence, as well as His work of creation. But yet David seems to recognize that this revelation of God is insufficient for making us right with God. There's a problem. He doesn't explain it so much in the 19th Psalm, but you'll notice that he makes a shift. After talking about God's revelation of Himself in creation, he then goes on to talk about the wonders of God's Word. And so he drives us to the Word revelation of God, that which God has spoken about Himself. Theologians make a distinction between God's general revelation in creation and works of providence and His special revelation in His Word. General revelation goes out to all of God's creatures. We all see the sun, the moon, the stars, and we all have God speaking to us from these things. In fact, our own nature speaks to us of God. Our conscience, our mind, will, and emotions tell us that we are made by a Creator who is a personal God. Everything around us and within us reveals God's nature to us. And we are without excuse. That is general revelation. The problem is not any deficiency in this revelation from God. It's not as though God's Word is unclear. The problem is that we are sinners. The Apostle Paul makes that clear in Romans chapter 1, where he says that the wrath of God is being revealed from the heavens because men have suppressed the truth about God. God has revealed His nature, His attributes in the world around us, but men have suppressed that knowledge in wickedness. They've rejected God's revelation of Himself. And so that made, if we were to know God truly, God would have to act in grace and reveal Himself in a special way in His